Hello, hello, hello. All right. Today's lecture is the second part of Jacksonian America. All right, ladies and gents. Uh, we wrapped up wrapped up part one with talking about the manly man, right? Andrew Jackson, the duelist, the violent killer. So today we're going to focus on the presidency. All right. To kind of get us all kicked off for that, we need to start really with the inauguration because it's where it all continues to be crazy. I mean, that's just the world with Jackson in it. Um, he comes into D.C. after winning the presidency in the election in 1828, and he gives his inaugural address in March of 1829. After he gives his inaugural address, the crowds have gone wild. The streets of DC are packed. It's said that most people couldn't hear the inaugural address because so many people were there, so many people were excited, and so many people were crazy drunk and partying up because Andy made it to the White House. One of the common men, right? So after he gave his address, most people didn't know what he had said until that evening or the next day when the newspapers printed it. After he gave the speech, he didn't ride in the coach to the White House like most did. He walked down the steps, hopped on his horse, and rode out right through the middle of the crowd. All right. Um, he took his own horse to the White House, and this is where the first crazy Animal House party begins. It is tradition at this point, Washington, Adams, Jefferson, Madison, Monroe, John Quincy Adams, all of these presidents had the inaugural ball. And this is just where the White House is open to the public. After the address, the president goes back to the White House and waits for people to visit. The White House staff supplies food, drink, and let people have some fun. Not really. Most of the time, I mean, from Washington through John Quincy Adams, this was a very formal affair. The you know the elites of Washington showed up, had tea, talked and congratulated, you know, did their customary things, and they would politely leave. Um, but for this one, for Andrew Jackson's inaugural ball, it seems like all of America showed up. The crazy Westerners, just the common man. People were all over the White House lawn. They were in the White House. They were standing on furniture. They were drinking heavily from the whiskey punch that was being supplied and eating the food. And it was just craziness. All right. Fights were breaking out. Um, the butler of the White House said that the average American at this party did more damage to the White House than the British did when they burnt it down. So it's pretty intense. It is a crazy party. Just imagine people bouncing on furniture, um, coming in and out of windows, um, swinging from light fixtures, partying hard in the White House, celebrating Andrew's victory. It got so crazy, Jackson would duck out a window and go back to his hotel because he got tired of the party. The White House staff panicked. They didn't know what to do with these people. And what they ended up doing was taking all the bowls of whiskey punch and putting it out on the White House lawn to get people out of the White House. I mean, they had been trashing furniture, the everything, and people broke windows. There was actually a hole knocked inside of one of the walls to get out to the yard to get to the whiskey. So the White House was thoroughly messed up. Like I said, it's kind of like Animal House, if you've ever seen that movie, or maybe even, yeah, also like Weird Science, an old John Hughes picture. So you have a wild, wild inaugural ball at the White House, and this would be the last time that you would have an open ball. Ever since then, it's been by invite only. No surprise there, right? You wouldn't want this kind of craziness every time. However, things really wouldn't change. Jackson was a wealthy man. He had his properties, he had his business, and everything. He didn't really need his salary from the White House, and it wasn't much of one. He only got 25,000 a year as salary, and most of that went to whiskey, booze, other, any kind of booze and food to entertain people. So he used that as his entertainment budget. Um, it was said after his 8 years in office, the White House was in disrepair, not only just from the inaugural party and the subsequent misuse of this part, of this place by Jackson, a wild frontiersman, I guess. But the White House during those years kind of became Andy's party pad. And without the calming influence of Rachel, who died before he became president, eh, he just really didn't care about things like that. So we have Jackson's first party in the White House. We'll end today with talking about his last crazy party in the White House. But in between then, we need to talk about his two terms. All right. Jackson's first term, serving from 29 through 32. All right. In this term, he enters the presidency at the age of 61 years old. And right off the bat, he has things to deal with. One of the things he's trying to do is end the banking system. He hates the national banking system. He believes the banks have it in for the common man, and that they are just controlled by rich, like elitist New York socialites, and he wants to get rid of them. And he calls it his war on Biddle's institution. All right. Biddle was a very wealthy New Yorker that controlled most of the national banking system. With this, from 1830 to 1834, Jackson would go to war with the banks, and he would finally destroy the banks. Um, he would use this money to pay off a lot of the national debt, but also this war with the banks, where he destroys this institution, ends up playing a large, large role in creating the next panic that will hit in 1837. Also during this time, we have what's known as the Peggy O'Neill or the Peggy O'Neill Eaton affair. This is one of the first, like, major um, sex scandals in D.C. All right. The reason it's such a big deal is she marries Senator Eaton, who would become Secretary of War Eaton. And he was one of Jackson's close friends. And Eaton and Peggy um, became friends. And after her husband would die, Eaton and her would marry almost immediately. Back then, it was customary to wait a year, and then after a year, you could date and then marry. But Eaton and Peggy did not wait that customary year and got married immediately. And this created a huge, huge gossip mill, pushing that Peggy and Senator Eaton had been having an affair while the husband was still alive and dying in the house, all this kind of stuff. And polite society in Washington deemed Peggy O'Neill Eaton a harlot, a whore, someone to have nothing to do with. And since she was a wife of a cabinet member in Jackson's administration, this became an issue because all the cabinet wives and cabinet members tended not to have anything to do with her. This really upset Jackson, very much so, because this reminded him of how Rachel, his wife, was treated. Remember, Rachel, her first marriage did not work out. She got divorced and Jackson married her, but the divorce had not been finalized, so they had to get married again. And throughout their whole relationship, throughout their whole marriage, she had been bashed for polygamy, for being a harlot, for being a woman of low caliber because of all of this. And remember, this is one of the things that Jackson killed so many men in duels over was his wife. So that someone was insulting one of his best friend's wives really got to him. He was really upset about this, and this was one of the things that made him clear out his cabinet. Most of his cabinet members would be pushed out, including the VP, who was John C. Calhoun from South Carolina. Calhoun would be pushed out, and Jackson would finish his first term with no VP and barely any cabinet members. So there's always drama around Jackson. Another thing that takes up most of this first term, well, actually all of the first term, is the idea, well, not the idea, the theory of nullification. This is an old political idea. From the beginning, people like Jefferson and many others talked about it when they were forming the Constitution and forming American government. The theory of nullification is that a state, if they meet in special legislation, could overturn a federal law. All right, and this idea would be continually pushed. You'll see that the Hartford Convention, in many ways, would have stuff, focus on how the states could fight back against the federal government. And in 1828, a pamphlet came out. Right, the pamphlet was called the Exposition and Protest. All right, the Exposition and Protest was all about the theory of nullification and talking about how states do have the right to nullify federal law. So this would lead into huge consequences. One of the first things that comes out of this is one of the most famous political debates in American history, the Hayne-Webster debate. All right. And this is, of course, about whether the theory of nullification is valid. This would lead us into what's known as the nullification crisis. The nullification crisis is pretty straightforward. All right. The South picked up the idea that nullification is fine. It is a part of the Constitution. It's Jeffersonian. And they could do it. So when the Tariff of 1832 came out, this was the largest tariff we had ever had in American history. And tariffs really hurt farmers. It helped American industry, but hurt American agriculture. So South Carolina decided to form a special legislation and vote this tariff down and refuse to do it. This would lead to a huge, huge maelstrom. When they voted it down, Andrew Jackson took this as a direct insult to him, but also to the nation. He believed that the federal government had the final say, the states did not. So he told South Carolina that if they refused to go by the law, he would raise an army and come and enforce the law. South Carolina then retorted, well, they will arm themselves and patrol the borders waiting for Jackson. So right here, you get a possible civil war. Jackson getting ready to arm, getting ready to build his military and go down and make South Carolina obey, and South Carolina saying they'll fight back. By this time, a lot of other southern states agreed with this idea of nullification and wanted to get rid of the Tariff of 1832 as well. And at least 5 other southern states said that if Jackson attacked South Carolina, they would come to South Carolina's aid. So, as you can see, with this could have been a civil war. And one more time, Henry Clay steps in to fix it. Henry Clay tames everything, calms everything, and fixes the situation. The whole idea behind this is that everybody would go by the Tariff of 1832, and every year after, each year after that, the tariff would go down and would continue to keep going down until it was back to what it had been originally in the first tariff. So the tariff is still around, but it would be reduced from there on out. So this saved yet another possible civil war. Jackson was pissed off. He was very angry. He was wanting to go down to South Carolina. So what Jackson would end up doing with this is saying, okay, well, I'll agree to this compromise too, but I have the right to come down there and do what I want. Right? He said he had the right as the president to march in and make a state do what they were supposed to do. With this, the South Carolina legislature met again and nullified him. But nothing ever came of that. So you get Jackson's first term. All right. In his second term, it's not as busy. All right. You have a lot less going on. But you have one of the most horrific events in American history. All right. This is, of course, the Indian removal. All right. In his second term, the Indian removal bill will be passed by Congress, and Jackson would get his removal and disposal idea pushed. He wanted to take the Indians, the Native Americans that were left in the East, and move them out to reservations in the West. You have, of course, the major tribes that he wanted. In the North, he wanted to get the Sac and Fox and move them west. In the South, he wanted the Cherokee, the Creek, the Seminole, the Choctaw, and the Chickasaw removed. And this would be his focus in the second term, is getting all of this ready. So with the Indian removal bill, they start rounding up the Native Americans. And then after they round them all up in northwestern Georgia, they start marching them out to Oklahoma. This is the last march. All right. They had been moving natives out this whole second term, but the very last march of natives to the west is the Trail of Tears, your key point. That is where they rounded up the Cherokee at the very, very end, more than 18,000 of them, and marched them in the dead of winter to Oklahoma. All right, more than, you have different numbers given, but right around somewhere between 4,000 to 5,000 to die. Some estimates say it's higher. But when you think about it, when you only have 18,000 people and about 5,000 of them die on this march from Georgia to Oklahoma, it's horrific. The government subsidized out this and paid private contractors to do these kind of things. And nobody bothered with blankets or good food or anything else for the natives. So being marched out with bad food and no protection from the weather and elements, many of them would die because of this. That is why it's called the Trail of Tears. So this is Jackson's last big thing. This is one of the big things that comes out of his second term is the Indian removal. Um, Little side note for you. Um, the reservation system that we set up here in America through this Indian removal bill that Jackson created, well, it was a part of and pushed and had been pushing his whole life. This reservation system was taken up by a certain dictator, a fascist dictator in Europe, and used as concentration camps to eliminate another group of people. Right? Hitler was a student of history and noticed the Indian removal and the reservation system that had been created. So, the concentration camps in Nazi Germany were inspired by the reservation system. All right. Lou. Also, with this presidency, we have a lot of firsts that we need to go over, and we'll go over them quickly. All right. Jackson drastically expanded presidential powers while he was in office. He declared that the president, not the Congress, represented the people, which was completely opposite of what all the other presidents had pushed. He actually overturned the Supreme Court one time. Um, he declared that the Union could not be peacefully dissolved. In other words, if anybody did secede or do anything against the United States of America, the federal government would crack down on them physically. Um, he is one of the few presidents that paid off the national debt. He did so because, he broke up the national banking system and had all that money and would use that to pay off the debt. He was the first to fire a cabinet member. And some stories say that he was it was a friend and an ally, but he was doing such a horrible job. Jackson got mad at him, clocked him upside the head, and fired him in the Oval Office. He was also the first to use troops to put down a labor strike in America. Of course, he is the one that removed the Native Americans from the eastern U.S. He also is the first to open diplomatic relations with China. He also gives us another thing, and this is one of the big things I want you to pull from Jacksonian firsts: the spoils system. All right, the spoils system is. Have you ever, more than likely you've heard of this saying, to the victor goes the spoils. So the spoils system in American politics is simple. When a person like Jackson gets into office, he hires friends, family, relatives, allies, and puts them into positions of power that will help him get stuff done, right? He doesn't necessarily hire by qualification or merit. He hires yes men and allies. So the spoils system would really take off during Jacksonian America and become the way of American politics. So we have Jacksonian firsts. The last thing that we're going to go over, and then I'll end this, is the story of the last party that Jackson throws in D.C. When he was wrapping up his presidency, he would throw one last monster party. All right. And it all has to do with this. Hopefully you can see the picture. All of those people standing around that big hunk of cheese. All right. So Jackson throws a cheese party. All right. This is a crazy story, a funny story. And so let's start from the beginning. In 1835, the dairy industry in upstate New York was booming. Everything was going great. And a man by the name of Colonel Tom S. Meacham decided that he wanted to show the world how well everybody was doing up there. So Meacham decided to make a cheese for the president and five smaller cheeses, one for the New York governor, the vice president, the Congress, Daniel Webster, and a few others. Well, another. But the big cheese, the commander in cheese, the one that will go to the White House, this cheese was 4 foot in diameter and 2 foot thick and weighed more than 1,400 pounds. All right. He Meacham milked 150 cows for 4 days to make that one cheese for Jackson. So imagine that a wheel of cheese that is 4 foot in diameter, 2 foot thick, and 1,400 pounds. It went to all the fairs in New York and then went on tour around New York. Not only did he make this big cheese, he engraved it artfully. He put this huge belt around the cheese that had pictures of the state, and it said, "The Union, it will be preserved." And he even made a bust of Jackson out of cheese. And all of these things he put on a boat and took to D.C. to give to Jackson. All right. He also had 5 other cheeses with him. Like I said, he gave one to the state legislature of New York, one to the governor of New York. He gave one to Daniel Webster. He gave one to the United States Congress. And he gave the other one, the 5th one, to Martin Van Buren, who was the vice president. Those 5 cheeses were smaller. They were only 700 pounds, so they were half the size of Jackson's cheese. So all this cheese went on tour and then went to D.C. and went to their people they were supposed to go to. Jackson would receive this cheese in 1836, bring it into the White House, and keep it in the hallway until he left office. As you can imagine, D.C. is in the South. It gets cold in the winter, but it gets really hot in the summer, and it's a very humid place. And very quickly, this cheese started to stink up D.C. It's said that certain times of the year, you could smell the White House cheese from blocks and blocks away, all over D.C. And Jackson, to his credit, took the cheese. He gave out cheese to everybody he knew. He sent cheese as presents. He's just got rid of as much cheese as he could through gift and everything else, but he still had this huge, huge thing of cheese. And at the end of his presidency, in 1837, the last day he would be in the White House, he had all the newspapers around post that he was going to throw a cheese party. Everybody that wanted to could come and get as much cheese as they wanted because he had to leave the White House and the cheese needed to be gone. So this sat in the White House for more than a year, stunk up the place. The White House staff said that it got into the curtains, it got into the wallpaper, it got into the carpet. The smell just permeated the White House. And on this last day, people from everywhere showed up. It was just as wild as it was in the inaugural ball. And people were cutting off huge chunks of cheese, passing it around, getting rid of it. By the end of the party, the cheese was gone, and it was all over. But they were saying that people were drinking, having fun, eating. That some of the what they call dandies and women fainted because the cheese smell was too intense to handle. So you've got this huge party with all kinds of people showing up. Oh, let's see. To take away the last of the Jackson cheese. So you have the cheese party, right? And Jackson leaves. Martin Van Buren, who was his vice president, gets elected to be the next president of the United States. And Van Buren moves into the White House. And Van Buren and the staff work for a couple years on redoing the White House to try to get rid of the smell of the cheese. All right. And it's just permeates everything, new drapes, new everything, repainting, just washing everything, and the smell still lingers. Um, Finally, you remember Van Buren had his own 700-pound piece of cheese, right? And Van Buren moved into the White House after he did all this work, got it back up to snuff and everything, and he put out an article in the papers as well saying he had a cheese that he was going to auction off and have the money go to things. But in all actuality, uh, Van Buren had already gotten rid of his cheese. What had really happened was before Jackson left, he had had the guy make another 700-pound piece of cheese and stashed it in a hidden place in the White House for Brent Van Buren to find later on. So, we started with Jackson loved pranks on people, right? So when Jackson left, he played a big prank on Van Buren. Van Buren spent more than a year cleaning up the White House to make it look nice, and then about the time he did, he found another big ass block of cheese that he had to get rid of. So, with that, we will end this second part of Jacksonian America and see you next time.